You know, one of the things that makes me really excited is whenever I find a reference to a medicinal plant in some sort of holy book or the context of a spiritual lineage or tradition. And, I found one in the Bible as Psalm 51:7, which says, "Purge me with hyssop so that I shall be clean. Wash me so that I might be as white as snow." And I just got really excited when I saw that, and I thought that was such a fitting note on this herb. And I think there's something about a plant being mentioned in the context of spirituality and religion that can lend us a lot of insights into how we might use that plant today in our modern world. So coming down into the garden today, we're going to be talking about Hyssop officinalis. We're harvesting it out of the garden today to take it into the lab to make a spagyric out of it. And I thought I'd share a little bit about my understanding of this herb with you. All right, so here we are in our humble little patch of hyssop, and going to start off sharing about some of the properties of this plant the way I always do, which is talking about the taste of this plant. So hyssop, the part used, we're using the aerial parts of the plant. Typically when it's in flower, we're getting ready to harvest this patch here pretty soon. It's kind of at its peak stage. The leaf is really the main part, but you really use the full aerial plant. And, you'd probably strip the stems off of it. But so this plant, hyssop, in the mint family, its Latin name is Hyssopus officinalis, or Hyssopus. I don't really quite know how to say it properly, but Hyssopus officinalis is usually how I say it. And so the taste of this plant, it's in the, as a mint family plant, it's in that unique category of mints that are both bitter and aromatic. So some of the mints we see are pretty much strictly aromatic, like lemon balm or like peppermint. Some are really strictly just straight bitter, like motherwort. And then you've got the ones that are combinations, bitter and aromatic. So, and that taste was definitely a little more bitter than aromatic. Some of the leaves that I've had were a lot more aromatic and pungent. But so we see pungent. It contains essential oils, so it has that pungent aromatic flavor coupled with the bitter flavor. And again, this is, and I've talked about this a lot, chamomile's like an aromatic bitter. This mugwort behind me is an aromatic bitter. And whenever we see aromatic bitters, we always immediately know that this is going to be a really great plant for digestion. So that's one of the core affinities of hyssop. It's affecting the digestive system quite nicely, stimulating secretions from the gastrointestinal tract, bringing blood flow to the gut, enhancing nutrition, digestion, and absorption. But one of the main affinities for this herb is the respiratory tract, and that's really how hyssop is used by most herbalists, is as a respiratory remedy, so affecting the throat, the bronchioles, and the lungs. I can already feel it, even just in that one little leaf, kind of feel it opening up my chest and my lungs a little bit, make me want to clear my throat a little bit more. So it's a really great respiratory remedy. And we see this plant, what's interesting about this herb is it's primarily used for the respiratory system, but when we read its properties, we see it's been used for darn near every organ system in the body. So it has traditional usage in working on the liver. So it was a classic remedy used to treat jaundice and liver stagnation kind of patterns. It's said to promote diuresis, so it has an influence on the kidneys and the urinary tract. As a pungent herb, it does increase circulation, so we have a little bit of a cardiovascular affinity. And then the immune system. So this is a classic remedy used for fevers. So it kind of works on what Matthew Wood always describes as the febrile mechanism, which it's kind of cool because he kind of talks about it almost as an organ system unto itself. The whole process of the physiological process of how herbs work on a fever, which oftentimes is through the circulation, oftentimes working on immunity, and oftentimes working on the neuromuscular control of the vasculature, so how dilated or contracted the blood vessels are. As a warming bitter, it will also have a slight affinity for the female anatomical reproductive system. So like that's a lot of organ affinities, right? But really the main and most important one for our purposes and the main usage of this plant, I would say kind of where this plant shines is in the respiratory system for sure. So then shifting over into our main actions of this plant. What we see is that as an aromatic bitter, it is having a carminative action in the gut. So those volatile essential oils are going to help to dispel gas, wind, bloating in the GI, bring blood flow to the gut. As a bitter, it's going to increase digestive secretions. So as a bitter tonic, we're stimulating the liver, a little bit of the gallbladder to secrete bile, pancreatic enzymes, stomach acid, all the secretions that enhance and optimize digestion will be stimulated with hyssop as a bitter tonic. But then we see it is a choice expectorant, and that's really how I've used it the most is as an expectorant. Now we see some interesting properties here with hyssop as an expectorant because on the one hand, it is a warming, aromatic, kind of stimulant expectorant herb, right? So it's helping to stimulate the lungs, the cough reflex to remove stagnant mucus. And one of the specific ways that it's been used for that is when there's a lot of heat in the tissue and it's baked down that mucus in the lungs. So it's really indicated for stuck phlegm, like phlegm that's become, it has adhered to the respiratory tissues and therefore is very difficult to expectorate. Those and it's twofold. On the one hand, the volatile oils are going to help to penetrate into that stuck stagnant mucus, disperse it and kind of break it up so that it's easier to expectorate. But then as a bitter, bitters increase secretions, and we tend to think of bitters increasing secretions like in the digestive system. But as I've mentioned in a lot of other videos, that bitter receptors are scattered all throughout the body. And so, you know, they're affecting the vasculature, they're affecting the heart, they're affecting certainly liver, gallbladder, digestion. Bitter receptors are bitter plants are doing a lot more than just stimulating digestion. And some bitter herbs will actually have an influence on the lungs. And that's what I believe is going on here with hyssop is, you know, we tend to think of herbs that moisten the lungs as really being demulcents, right? Licorice, marshmallow, slippery elm, plantain, you know, these are kind of our good demulcent expectorants that really moisten the lungs. But hyssop is actually traditionally used for very dry lung conditions. It's very specific for dry coughs. And at first that's kind of surprising, you know, if you're looking at the properties and the energetics of this herb, which we'll talk about in a minute. You would kind of assume this would be used for a wet cough, right? Because it's so pungent and warming and dispersive and stimulant expectorant. Typically, we think of stimulant expectorants for really wet coughs. But in this case, hyssop is actually really good for a dry cough. And you know, when I think about that, kind of the physiological process of when you want to use it. So say there's a respiratory tract infection of some sort. Your mucosal membranes are secreting mucus to try to, you know, clear and cleanse the respiratory tissues. But because there's infection, there's heat, there's a lot of immunological activity. And so what happens is that heat like cooks down that mucus. And as it cooks it down, those fluids are evaporating off, and that mucus becomes thick and hardened, and it kind of gets sticky and it adheres to the respiratory tissue, and then you get this cough that it's dry. And it's not that the mucosal membrane is like dry and cracked like a you know, a clay desert, you know. It's more that it's like if you think of a pond that's the water's evaporating down, and then you get that kind of slimy, sludgy layer on top, but there's not enough fluid there for it to be liquidy. It's like there's a dryness there. So that's really when hyssop is very excellent to be used for a cough. So that's kind of zooming in a little bit on the stimulant expectorant property here of hyssop. but it's unique in that it is actually very good for a dry cough, hoarse voice, dry, sore throat. Really, really good remedy here. And I think, so to second that, so the volatile oils dispersing, breaking up that stagnant mucus, but then the bitters are gonna kind of get those mucosal membranes secreting again. And this is really important for respiratory health, because when your mucosal membranes in the lungs start secreting more, they're bringing fresh antibodies, fresh immunological factors to the local area, which ultimately helps fight the infection. One of the other main ways that this herb has been used traditionally is as a diaphoretic. So this is a classic fever remedy, that of course being coupled with its property as an expectorant makes it really, really great for, you know, your coughs, colds, flus. It's funny, we always lump those things together. A cold and the flu are actually really different. You know, colds are typically more sinus congestion, maybe a little cough, but you don't have fever. Influenza is typically always accompanied by fever. So this is, I guess it's more of a flu remedy, but it'll work for a cold as well. So really great for stimulating diaphoresis, making the body sweat, driving heat from the core out to the periphery. It was classically used for a lot of febrile conditions, scarlet fever, measles, typhoid fever, things like that. Some of those aren't exactly common conditions that we treat today, but that's how it was classically used, and we can kind of take, you know, that type of sickness and think of what is happening in our modern world and apply it in that way too. Hint, hint. So it could be very applicable potentially for treating COVID, especially as that later stage of COVID ends up with a very dry cough typically. Well, the new variants are a little bit different, but kind of the original variants, as the disease progressed, you would end up with this very dry cough, and I think this remedy would be really remedial for it. I haven't actually used it too much for COVID clients of mine, but I haven't really had a whole lot of it around, and after kind of digging into this remedy in a little more detail, it's like, oh, that would make a really good COVID remedy. So that's something to consider in the combination of expectorant, diaphoretic. Great remedy there. So yes, and as a bitter tonic, I mentioned it having an influence on the liver. It does have some diuretic properties, so it can be used to help flush the kidneys a little bit. And really kind of a systemic remedy, right? I mean, it does have this nice specificity for the lungs and the febrile system, but really I think of this as kind of a systemic, almost protective kind of plant in the way that it's influencing so many organ systems in the body. Okay, and then the final action that I wanted to mention is that this is actually a really great antiseptic plant too. So the volatile oils, the bitter principles have antiseptic properties. Matthew Wood actually notes that the leaves of this plant can grow, I believe it's a yeast or a fungus on it that actually contains penicillin. So that's pretty interesting. And so it is, again, a great remedy for treating infection here, because it does have antiseptic properties, and that coupled with the way it's supporting fever and supporting cough, really choice plant here. So in terms of its energetics, because it is so warming and because it is bitter, we will see that it, or because it, I guess I just kind of gave it away. It's considered a warming plant in terms of its influence on temperature. And you know, this might vary from plant to plant. Like if you have a hyssop that doesn't taste that aromatic and is just like, whoa, really bitter, that particular plant might be more on the cooling side. If you get some that are more pungent and aromatic, then that might be more on the warming side. But generally speaking, we tend to consider hyssop to be a warming plant. So treating cold type issues in the body. So again, and I know that kind of seems counterintuitive. It's like, oh wait, I thought you said it was for a fever. Well, the fever is the body's natural response to the presence of a pathogen. And if we think of depression, like depression in the tissues, like when the liver is stuck and stagnant and it's not able to process things as well, it's considered depressed. It's not doing its job. When digestion is not functioning optimally, we have digestive depression. When the lungs can't expectorate and do their job, we have lung depression. So as a stimulant, this plant is warming and stimulating these tissues into a greater level of activity. And so it's really great for cold patterns in the body. But yet we see all these indications for inflammations. So it's almost like inflammation that arises due to cold. And I know that sounds kind of paradoxical, like, well, how can you be hot and cold at the same time? Well, if you think of like the progression of something, if you have cold in the body in its vital wisdom responds to that. And it might respond to that by creating inflammation, by trying to move that stagnation, move and disperse that depressed tissue or organ. And so you get this heat response due to cold. And that's where hyssop is going to be really, really specific there. So it's going to warm and stimulate the depressed tissue state underneath it, and on the surface help with the heat patterns that are arising due to that vital response of the cold. So warming, and then in the long-term effect, we're going to see it typically having more of a drying effect as a pungent plant, as a bitter plant. These are all secretions leaving the body in the long term, but in the short term, again, we will see it having, because it's increasing secretions. So like in the lungs, it's great for a dry cough in the short term, but if you're taking hyssop every day for months and months and months, you know, it's promoting sweating, it's promoting diuresis, it's promoting digestive secretions. These are all fluids leaving the body, which will ultimately in the long run have a net drying effect. And, you know, I think that's a really important distinction and way to think about and understand plants, is the importance of looking at a plant in terms of there's kind of two different polarities that I think of. Is you have the local effect on a tissue or an organ in contrast to its constitutional effect on the whole body. So locally in the lungs, it's increasing a secretion, but those secretions ultimately leave the body and will in the long run have more of a drying effect. So local versus constitutional, and then short-term versus long-term effects. So again, short-term, you take a bitter, it increases digestive secretions. That's technically a moistening effect. But in the longer term, if those fluids leave the body, in the long run, you're left more dry. So I think this is one of the ways that we can actually kind of start to understand why, when you're looking up energetics of herbs in different resources and books, you can sometimes see conflicting information. Some people say it's moistening, some people say it's drying. It's like, what the hell are you supposed to do with that, right? It's super confusing. Well, one author might be looking at, they might say hyssop is moistening, and they say, well, it's moistening because it treats a dry cough. Well, that's looking at a local short-term effect. It's true. Another author might say, hyssop is drying. That might be because they're looking at the whole constitutional picture over the long term, which is that it's diuretic, it's bitter tonic, it's diaphoretic. These are all fluids leaving the body, therefore it's drying. So this is one way that I'm always thinking about plants, especially when I see contradictory information. Typically, that's if you start to put those factors into play, like you start thinking about those factors, all of a sudden it starts to make a little bit more sense why you might see those conflicting information. So, and then warming, drying long-term, slightly moistening short-term, dry cough and things like that. And then we will see it having a stimulant effect as well. It's not overly tonic or astringent, nor is it overly relaxant. This is not one of our nervine mints. So it's really much more oriented in respiration and fever and things like that. So These are some of the core properties of hyssop. It's just a really lovely plant to have in the garden. I love these purple flowers, and it's just a really nice plant to have around. And Whitney's going to share a little bit about her experience in growing this plant, and then I'll come back and share a little bit of the psychological and specific indications, as well as some of our archetypal rulerships.
So I don't have a ton to share about this herb because it's just so easy to grow. A lot of mint family plants are just take off on their own and get themselves established pretty well, and are really easy to grow. So a lot of those mint family plants are awesome in that way for anybody getting into gardening. If you feel a little timid about your green thumb, you boost your confidence by growing some easy herbs like this. Hyssop germinated pretty well by seed, and it's just, I sowed it in flats and then planted all of these out in the spring, and it's a pretty vigorous herb, so pretty easy to grow. I just also would say that it's wonderful for pollinators, so it's great to have around in that respect. The bees and the butterflies are usually just covering this whole patch, so it's lovely to have around. And for harvesting, we're gonna harvest this fresh and distill the essential oil for a superioric essence, but we also would tincture it fresh in about a 50% alcohol. And it also can be made into a cough syrup, so that would be another way that you could kind of preserve it and use it as well. The herb could be also harvested and the aerial parts and then dried and used in teas later on. So that's just a little bit about this plant. It's pretty simple and just a good general herb to have around.
All right, so just a little bit to share on some of the psychological picture of this plant. And this is coming from David Dalton, who is a flower essence practitioner, and he kind of developed the mental profile and picture of this plant based on his clinical experience in working with hyssop flower essence. And really what he says about it is that it has to do with people with feelings of guilt. And there's a sense of kind of feeling unclean within oneself, and kind of like people that punish themselves, people that are really kind of like beating themselves up in a way, and they don't feel like they don't feel like they deserve good things in their life. They don't feel like they deserve happiness. There's even like a fear of punishment, whether that's, you know, from another person or maybe spiritual punishment. This book does have some biblical references. You know, they say in the Bible to purge oneself with hyssop so that you'll be clean. So there is some traditional kind of spiritual or religious perspectives on this plant in the way that it cleanses the body, and it seems like there might even be some associated spiritual purification that goes along with it, which I think is really interesting. And it's not one way that I've really worked with this herb, but it's something that I'd like to. We're probably going to be making a spagyric essence of this plant, which, you know, the spagyric essences are really cool because they bring out all of and concentrate the physical properties of the herbs alongside with those subtle psychological, emotional, and spiritual properties of the herb too, many of which are, you know, noted in the flower essence type preparations. So we're going to be making an essence out of this plant. I'm actually really looking forward to working with it in that form. It'll be the first time we've made the essence of it, in which we'll distill out the volatile oils and ferment it into a wine, distill all the alcohol off of the wine, and then calcine all of the alkaline mineral salts and put all that back together. The sulfur, the mercury, and the salt, as they say in alchemy. So thinking of this plant alchemically in terms of its relationship to the archetypes. Now, so Culpepper places hyssop under the rulership of Jupiter. And it's really interesting to me, like when I look at this plant, it doesn't scream Jupiter to me, you know? But oftentimes, in my understanding of it, Jupiter plants, to me, the archetypal Jupiter plant is burdock, right? Big leaves, really stout plant, thick, oily root, really working as an alterative, and working through the liver strongly, which is Jupiter's main correspondence. So, I mean, I guess I don't really see hyssop so much as that strongly as a Jupiter plant. It's quite likely and possible that Culpepper understood this herb in a little bit of a different way in terms of its Jupiter kind of nature. The one way that I kind of think of it that makes sense as a Jupiter plant is in medical astrology. They say wherever Jupiter is in your natal chart is an innate place of protection. So they say Jupiter is like the great benefic. It's like Jupiter kind of wraps you in this nice, warm, cozy, beneficial, encouraging, uplifting hug. and so I kind of think of that in the way that, you know, hyssop, even though we've mentioned talking about it, working on respiration and fever and things like that, it does have an influence on the kidneys, on the liver, on the gallbladder, and the digestive system, on all these different organ systems, and kind of having a bit of a property everywhere. And in that way, kind of working almost as this constitutional, slightly purifying herb to the body, and through that, an innate protection. So, and of course, you know, it was traditionally used for jaundice, which is a you know, relatively severe liver condition showing liver stagnation and things like that. And the liver is the main organ governed by Jupiter, but I personally tend to think of this more as a mercurial plant. It has the morphology of it is pretty mercurial in that it's small, it's slender, it's thin. It's, you know, the way it kind of grows up in that way. The purple coloration can be a mercurial indicator in some remedies, but just kind of the thinness and daintiness of it to me is distinctly mercurial. The aromatic property, of course, is very mercurial, and even the way that it has the aromatic property, which is very volatile, and then the bitter property, which is more fixed, and that's kind of like this. In a way, it's kind of like a polarity in herbal constituents, where you have the aromatics and the bitters. To me, is the way I think of them. They kind of exist in these kind of above and below, so to speak. Some are very alcohol soluble. The bitters tend to be more water soluble. And then, of course, its action on the lungs. As a primary respiratory remedy, mercury is the main ruler of the lungs, so that makes a lot of sense as well. Thinking of it in terms of the elements, we could put this under the fire element. We do notice that the leaves kind of are lance shaped, coming to a nice sharpish tip. So fire element does make sense, especially in the way that this herb is very warming, very dispersive, very stimulant. It's used to treat fever. It's used to treat heat and inflammation acutely, but it also has that warming property that's dispersing coldness, which is a natural fire element quality there. So to me, the fire element makes a lot of sense for this plant, mercury and the fire element. So those are some of the ways that I think about this plant archetypally. Really excited to be harvesting it and taking it into the lab to work with it, see what the volatile oils are like. I'm very curious to see how hyssop will distill. And then one last thing I wanted to mention that's an interesting little tidbit. I remember when I was studying with Matthew Wood at the Philo School of Herbal Energetics a long time ago. Boy, that was over 20 years ago now. Crazy. No, not 20 years ago. It was over 15 years ago. It's like, wait a minute. How old am I? The woman who was hosting that, Mary Pat Palmer, great herbalist, and she was, I believe, friends with Dale Pendle, who wrote that really cool 3-part botanical series, the Pharmacopoeia series. Really interesting herb books. But in his absinthe recipe, a traditional absinthe recipe, he said that one of the key ingredients in traditional absinthe was actually hyssop. And he says that I remember them talking about it and him noting that absinthe with hyssop was notably more consciousness altering and unique in its consciousness alteration than in absinthe that did not feature hyssop. So I don't know what would be contributing to that. I mean, certainly this is not generally considered, you know, a psychoactive plant per se on its own, but it does seem to change some of the dynamics around an absinthe preparation, which of course the primary herb in there being wormwood or Artemisia absinthium, and kind of producing that unique way in which, I mean, of course it's alcohol, so that's also primarily how it's altering consciousness, but anyone that's ever drank some absinthe knows that it's very different in the way that it makes you feel than other types of alcohol, in a similar way that tequila makes you feel a lot different than whiskey or something like that. So that's just kind of an interesting little informational tidbit about hyssop that I thought I would throw in there. So hopefully you learned something good about hyssop. Drop us a comment below. Love to hear about any ways that you have used and experienced hyssop. And of course, if you have not done so ever before, head on over to evolutionaryherbalism.com. Sign up for our email list. We're putting content out like this out every week over there, and lots of free resources there on our blog and mini courses and things like that. If you're listening on the podcast, be sure to subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the like and subscribe button. It really does help the channel out and helps us be able to continue to produce free content for the herbal community. So that's one simple way that you can support us, is just follow us on our channels, Facebook and Instagram and all of that. And you know, these are just these little herb videos that we've been doing lately, just kind of spotlighting a single plant. These are just little tastes and me trying to share with you, you know, some of the core properties and how to think about and how to understand a plant holistically. You know, you'll notice that I don't just say, oh, hyssop, yeah, it's good for a cough, you know. The way I like to teach plants is to share what are the core properties, what's the core pattern in the plant, and then how do you take your understanding of that core pattern, that essence in the plant, and translate that pattern into the pattern in the people in terms of how you would use it therapeutically. And for people that want to be an herbalist, not just, you know, use herbs at home, but people that actually want to be an herbalist, that's the best way to understand your plants. Know their core properties before you start understanding what it's good for and how it's used. You got to have a basis, have your basis of the plant be on those core medicinal patterns. So that's what I'm hoping you're catching on to in our plant profile videos here on the channel. Hopefully you've been enjoying them. And of course, if you want more, there's always a lot more that can be said about all of these plants. I'm just kind of sharing what I know about these remedies just kind of off the top of my head. I'm sure these are not the most comprehensive plant profiles in the world, but if you do want what I think to be the most comprehensive plant profiles in the world, check out our course, Materia Medica Monthly. This is a monthly subscription program where I will go 2 to 3 hours on one plant, going through its pharmacy, its pharmacology, safety, its clinical patterns, a lot of depth on kind of what we talk about here, tastes and actions and affinities. We'll talk about formulations, go into a lot of depth on the archetypal associations of the plants, literally that 2 to 3 hours on each herb. And we've been running that course for quite a number of years now. So we've got a very extensive Materia Medica in there. It's only $27 a month. So head on over to our website, check out Materia Medica Monthly. You can sign up for it anytime, and that's a really nice, affordable way to go a lot more in depth and learning about the medicinal plants from the evolutionary herbalism perspective. So once again, thanks so much for joining me in this video. Hope you learned something good. Until the next one, take care and be well.